So welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. We're so honored to have in the museum this week artist Fidencio Fifield-Perez, and to get the opportunity to see him installing his really beautiful and meaningful work. I think Fidencio probably has a few stories to tell you about how this work came to be and how it relates to his own life experience. So thank you so much for speaking with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Linda, for just getting me out here, I think. And thank you to the museum and then the students that drove all the way from Liberty, Kansas. Thank you for coming. So the work that you see in front of you, this piece and then that piece and the one in the hallway, I'm thinking, I guess, the overarching theme for them is this idea of maps. There's literal maps, and then this whole installation is created using maps, but also the prints of maps, maps that are decaying. And then the two other pieces are, I'd like to think, yes, they're utilizing maps, but they get away from the inherent object. So for this one, last year I lived in Galveston, Texas as part of a residency that I was awarded. And during my time there, I was making these installations also, and a friend of mine said, I know this person that you really should meet. And so before I knew it, I had an ex-Border Patrol agent in my studio. And as strange as that might have been, it was very strange. And so he saw some of the work and he said, you're utilizing these pins. And I don't know if you know, but on the border there's this program where for every body that is found, a pin is supposed to represent that body. And yes, I did know the program, and what I didn't know though is that this person that was now in my studio was part of the program that created the system. And through those conversations, I came to find out that not only was an ex-Border Patrol agent, but that he had created maps while he was out there looking for people essentially like myself. Ironically, he was in charge of looking at the very place where I crossed when I was 7 years old. And so now, interestingly enough, because of this time, I don't know that some people would consider this like a very strange relationship, but it was interesting and beneficial, I think, to realize that we both didn't represent the stereotypes that were imposed on one another. And so what you see there is actually his drawing while he's out there looking for people. And there's something strange about the fact that now I'm looking and inspecting all of his ephemera from him searching for people like myself. And so that's the latest series, but again, that was important because it gets away from this idea of using a map. I think it talks about also the potential for people to create their own maps, thinking about maps in terms of time, and also who gives power to maps. Then the other piece out there came out of looking at all these headlines that talked about immigrants, about undocumented people, about DACA recipients like myself. And what I realized in collecting all of those newspaper clippings was that the way that the media was describing myself was very void of any humanity. A lot of terms that are used to describe myself are similar to a surge, a wave, an influx, a swarm, an avalanche of people coming in. And why is it that we talk about people that have hopes and dreams that way? And so that piece was very much a response of saying, like, if that's how you describe us, then like that's what I'll depict. And again, it's using maps that have been touched and that people have given away to me at this point. So again, all of it is using maps, but I'd like to think that it's getting away from what they represent and maybe start to have some conversations about not just what it is, but what it could be. Yeah, and so if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Could you tell us a little more about what this depicts?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's a great question because when I first made it, I had no idea what it was. This was that piece over there was the first piece, and it was essentially just like the piece of paper that was in my studio to collect the drippings that came out of my paintings, I thought that the paintings were going to be, that's what I was pursuing, and the paintings ultimately ended up being so bad that professors just told me not to put them out there. But I had someone really great come into my studio and say, like, the stuff in your floor is way more interesting. And so I ended up cutting the stuff on the floor, and that's the first piece that you see over there on the left. And what I quickly realized was that, yes, the paintings were horrible, and that the stuff on the floor, the little ephemera, the trash, was way more important because sometimes I have a hard time speaking about like what it really is, but I know, as Linda was a couple days ago was saying, I think I tend to feel things, but I can't really describe them. And as after the first few days of just having these on the wall, I was trying to go to bed, not really knowing what I was making in the studio. And as I was trying to go to sleep, this thought came into my head of when was the last time you thought in Spanish, and what did that transition look like? And that thought it was one of the saddest moments of my life because I realized that one day I just stopped thinking in Spanish, and I all of a sudden started thinking and dreaming in English, and I never realized that transition. And then because I am a recipient of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, an undocumented person, I've never felt fully part of this country, even though I've been raised here for 20 years this November. And so when I think about that in-between spot of like not thinking in Spanish or English, not feeling like I live here and wanted here, that limbo is essentially what this is for me, because it also, a lot of the colors and shapes comes from having memories of being on the border, of being and walking in the sand, and being around brambles and having to hide in them. And so that's where the imagery, the shapes come in from. So this whole thing, I'd like to think, just represents those complex feelings of always being stuck in the middle of someplace. And you'll see figures, and they are made of maps. The whole thing is essentially made of maps, reproductions of maps, prints of maps. And so in a way, the figures are portraits of myself, but also people that I know who have to traverse through this landscape. And maybe we get stuck in the landscape, and so we get tangled in there. I think about my own mother, who still doesn't believe that she grasps English as well as I know that she can. But I like to think that this represents her too, in the way that she's stuck in that language in between. And so for me, that's where I get a lot of the shapes, the inspiration, and keep making it bigger. Any other questions?
It's interesting that the figures are all, so the background is very mixed, and there's a lot more dark and a lot of kind of complex colors, but the figures are all very light. And it seems to me that that's part of the symbolism. Is that off, or is that something you intended?
Somewhat. Again, it's like I go off feelings, but I love your read on it. For me, the reason why they're so light is because I want them to be fragile. I think it talks about the fragility of the conditions that it is to live here undocumented, that you're always, there is no safety, and that you will get stuck in some in-between, whether it be like a health system that doesn't provide you with anything, or like not being able to speak the language or assimilate. So for me, it's more maybe the light gets back to fragility, and that it was intentional, because again, this topic is fragile, and we're all on edge, I think. And also knowing that, like, because they're so fragile, they're gonna get stuck eventually. The many times that I have to move it from place to place to place. But maybe I never considered light as a word to describe it. Yeah. I hope that answered.
Thank you.
Yeah, likewise.
I'm tool did you use to cut? Did you treat the paper with any material before you cut? And also, how do you transport these things? I mean, 3 questions.
Yeah, no, great questions. I didn't treat a lot of the maps, so they come straight out of almanacs or whatever people give me, and so they're not treated. I use an X-Acto. Plenty of X-Actos. And then the third question is how do I transport them, which I think every time I go into an exhibition, I pull up in a small little Prius. And everyone is just horrified that somewhere in there the artwork is supposed to be. But it all fits. I sandwich them all in between sheets of paper and then I roll them up. And that's intentional too. I keep them paper because it's the material that's most common to me or that I feel most familiar to, and it utilizes a lot of papel picado, which is native, or it's used in Oaxaca, Mexico, and I remember that being the first tool and only art object I had growing up. And yeah, it's paper, so I hopefully want people to be uncomfortable about like, if I touch it, it will rip, or like, be concerned about this thing. I think for me it evokes someone to come closer, also maybe inspect someone's handwriting over there in that piece and talk about like Dead Man's Cave, or realize that maybe the words in there are a little loaded. So I do it all intentionally, cutting by hand and paper. It talks about for me also the debate about skilled versus unskilled labor. Why is it that there's an emphasis for like some type of labor but not like restaurant work or people that have to work in fields because that work can't be done by machines. And so why is that seen as unskilled? And this skill, but in reality, like it's just me cutting with an X-Acto. So hopefully all of it gets back to like the arbitrariness of the system that is immigration within this country. Yeah.
Could you say something about the piece in the hall that's titled Fishers of Men?
Fishers of Men, yeah. As my husband was telling me, it's a loaded, it's a biblical term, but also Fishers of Men. I mean, the use of this fence motif is intentional because it literally holds all of the writing up. It's what keeps the art hanging. And it's paper, so hopefully it talks about the fragility of any border fence. And that was the first time where that was the response to making work that I wanted to, stand up rigid, but then it would collapse and look like a net. And so I thought, what would happen if I mix these two motifs, essentially, a fence and a net, and also because they function the same, or their intention with this debate is the same, their purpose for a fence and a net. But yeah, so I wanted to see like what that one was directly like, what would a havoc or a surge, an influx of something look like? I like to think that it's a disaster right on the edge of like the fence. It's a snapshot, I think, before like it breaks. Or visually, also the fence comes in sometimes, or the net at times. So there's some visual components playing there.
I love that you titled this piece Surge, as you were saying, all the natural disaster language. When I found that you titled that piece Fishers of Men, of course I thought of the biblical phrase where Jesus says to his disciples, I will make you fishers of men. But then I thought, maybe the border patrols are fishers of men, also trying to hunt down and capture people.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, a lot of the words and how we talk about them are so similar.
Like a double meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'd like to think that like there's little bits of poetic references here, whether it be biblical or visually. I've had people tell me those look like alligators or reeds, and that's great. It gets people into the door. Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question about this piece.
Okay.
You said that these are multiple pieces that you put up. So my question whenever you display this piece entirely, is it the same composition every time, or do you also change it? And if so, why, or has that changed the meaning or symbolism for you in the composition?
So, it never looks the same. Sometimes I want it to look the same because I really like an iteration, but the space also changes. This happens to be the biggest one yet, but I've had some be like 12 feet, and this is nearly 40 feet. So it's never the same, and then I'm always cutting, and so there's new pieces. There's a piece in there that has never been exhibited, and yeah, it's always growing, literally. And then all of these end up breaking, and so they just become the ground itself, the figures. Was there another question?
Well, yeah, I was just curious if you do change the composition.
Yeah.
Do you think of a different story at that time, or does it symbolize anything else?
Yeah.
Change it?
Absolutely. So there's over here. There's some like cooler tones, and that was intentional. At the time, I wanted to make one that just had kids, and this was a couple years ago before any talk about like a surge of kids, incidentally. But it was just about, it had two figures in them, and it was essentially like a child that was my age when I crossed, and it was a response to the story that my mom told me once, where when I asked her, like, do you know anyone that didn't make it across the border? And she said, I do. And then she told me of her friend, who I remember growing up, how she would come to our house for dinner. And one day she just never came back. And I asked her, like, why did she not come into the house? And she said, because my friend had two kids, and she saw how I had crossed the border with you, and that you had made it, and she had kids in Mexico, and she said she saved up all her money for a year, and then finally sent for her two kids. And as the kids were crossing, one of them just never made it, just passed, and the other brother just was never the same. And so her life was ruined, and she had to leave. And she never spoke to my mother because she was mad and jealous, a bag of emotions. And I asked her, how old were the kids? And she looked at me and just said, they were your age when you crossed. And so this was very much a response to that, of crossing at night when it's cold, there's no color, it's just kids. At the end of the day, they were kids. And so that's what I had in mind when I was thinking of this. But now it's gotten bigger, and maybe like this is evening, night, and that's during the day, but the colors were intentional. Over there on the left, they're warmer pinks and yellows and oranges. And I've had someone tell me like that looks like a bridge of some sort, so I'd like to think that as the time goes on, it's maybe an illustration of figures just crossing from this little landscape, but it's a snapshot of just like, also it's a snapshot of them becoming the landscape as they burn more and more.
Or even making it. I mean,
Absolutely.
I think there's that feeling that they are almost creating it, they're almost you creating it.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
I feel like they're trying to move it aside. They're trying to move something aside so they can come forward.
I love those, yeah. And that's intentional. Sometimes I make one that looks like its leg is being pulled, and then another one looks like he's mending something. Because again, for me, I like to think that it's complex. The whole thing is. Yes?
I apologize for taking late, but you may already have spoken to this, but the pins that are in.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's this program that I was introduced into when I was in college, and essentially there's a system out there where for every body that is found on the border, a pin is dropped. And as you zoom out, you all of a sudden get bombarded with this field of pins. And that realization was really maddening and sad, because why is it that pin is supposed to represent my life, my hopes, my stories? But at the same time, how is it that we have allowed that many pins to be placed on that ground? And so that's why I started using pins, the connotation, the content that it represents for me. And it's also the little thing that holds him to come into my studio and be a friend of a friend. And he looked at the pens and he said, you know what, my job was part of making that graph in that system. And so he really just like cemented, like, I need to keep using these things because even though for me it's really an emotional reason, clearly other people know about it. And again, how is it that like it's supposed to represent? It tells me nothing about, those statistics tell me nothing about who the person was, their sexuality, nothing. And so, yeah, it's really sending and manding for me. But yeah, there.
Is there anything in the color or that's random?
The map that I was looking specifically, it was all red pins, red dots. So hence a lot of red ones in here mostly. Any other questions? Any other questions?
So the gesture of the figures, what are they doing?
For me initially it was that they're just trying to get from like this point to that point, so they're just trying to make it through the landscape. Some are getting caught. But again, I love that other people see that they're mending the landscape itself. We're trying to pull someone else out. I love the fact that it's open. It's almost like an open question. Yeah, no problem. Any other questions?